and we'll get started. So thanks again for joining me for this workshop on growing and saving seed from Indigenous plants. Again, my name is Matthew Kemshaw, and I'll acknowledge the territories again. We're on the Saanich and Esquimalt territories, pardon me, the Songhees and Esquimalt territories. They're also the Wasanic territories. I am quite nervous presenting this as a beginner, and I'm very grateful for all of you being here today. I'm really excited to share this presentation that I've put together for you. So a little bit more about me. I am a third generation settler here on these territories. My family immigrated from England in the early 1900s. My mother's grandfather arrived here in 1911, and my father's grandfather arrived here in 1918. And they brought their families to southern Vancouver Island, and we've been living here on Vancouver Island ever since. I grew up in Shawnigan Lake, and have lived most of my adult life in Victoria. I've also spent some time in Vancouver. And since I finished my undergraduate degree in environmental studies and political science, I've been really interested in learning how to grow plants and how to grow food. And I started out working with Life Cycles in their growing schools program, uh, teaching kids about growing plants and growing food. And I learned a lot from elementary students at first, and got very curious and interested in first growing vegetable plants. And then I'd always really had a love and appreciation for the forest and for natural environments. And I became more and more interested in growing indigenous plants as well. And I've taken on a few projects over the years in Vancouver and here in Victoria on trying to sort of rewild very urban, very disturbed sites. And so I have quite a bit of experience in the last 10 years with trying to um, bring biodiversity and indigenous plants back to very disturbed and difficult sites to grow on. So I'm excited to share some of my learnings from that work. This is the first workshop I've done on growing and saving plants from growing and saving indigenous plants, and I'm really excited for the opportunity to share this work with you. So today, the agenda for the presentation is to talk about Indigenous stewardship and colonization on this place and in these lands, and then talk a bit about the current context and where we live and some of the things that are good to know if you're trying to grow and save seed from Indigenous plants. And we're going to talk a little bit about site planning and plant selection, thinking probably that a lot of you are here interested in growing Indigenous plants on yours or other properties. And so I wanted to talk a bit about some of the considerations to make before you start planting. And then we're going to talk specifically about planting from seed and caring for seedlings, so the act of planting seeds. And then we'll talk at the end about saving seed from Indigenous plants. So at the end of each of these sections, I'll pause and check if anybody has any questions in the chat box, or if they want to pose any questions. So I wanted to start by sharing this map, which shows the land around Victoria. This is the first survey that was ever done when they were originally planning Fort Victoria. And all of the light brown or sort of gray that you see on here is meadowlands. And this is a really clear indication that the land here from downtown Victoria, and you can see where Fort Victoria was as a small little dot, kind of just below left of center on the screen, all the way up to UVic. It was big fields of meadows that were actively managed and maintained by Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic people. These meadows were managed for the production of camas and other kinds of lily bulbs for food. And people used fire as a way of managing the lands to produce camas. And um, Indigenous peoples have been stewarding and caring for plants on this place for many, many, many generations. And I think it's really important to recognize when we're talking about growing and saving seed from indigenous plants that these plants aren't just wild plants that have been growing all on their own. That there's been an active sort of cultivation that people have been practicing with these plants for a lot longer than there have been European people around in this place. Indigenous people worked very carefully with the land and knew these plants really well and tended and cared for them, and not just camas and the acts of burning camas meadows. There was a lot of work that Indigenous people did with all sorts of different crops. And certainly crops isn't probably the right word. It's a very colonized way of approaching this subject. But these plants have been and continue to be stewarded and cared for by Indigenous people for a very, very long time. And this map I've always thought was a really interesting sort of depiction of the land around Victoria and what it looked like when Europeans arrived. So the place here has a remarkable cultural and linguistic diversity in history, and I wanted to actually show you sort of the territories of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich people, because I think it is important for us to know where we are here. And so I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, see if I can move this. And I want to take you to the websites of the Wasanich and Songhees people. So here we have the Lekwungen traditional territories. These are the territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt people. And I know that maps haven't been a preferred way of sharing these territories, but it seems increasingly as settler folks like myself who are in love with maps are more interested, we see more of these kinds of maps showing the territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt people. And the WSANIC website seems to be offline right now, and I'm sorry about that, but there's a really great map that has been created that shows all of the place names of the WSANIC people, and it's interesting to see how much overlap there is in these territories. But these people have been stewarding and caring for the land here since time immemorial. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen again and go back to my presentation. So early colonizers forced the separation between Indigenous stewards and the land, and they outlawed Indigenous people from stewarding and harvesting most of this place. Settlers brought fast change to the region, and they drained wetlands, tilled soil, and introduced new crops and pests. And this first wave of colonization was one in which the relationship between settlers and Indigenous people was really characterized by an active policy of genocide. Indigenous cultures and ways of knowing were outlawed and actively fought against. There was a sort of second wave of colonization, which probably began around the time my great-grandfathers arrived in the early 1900s. This was sort of one of urbanization and the institutionalization of racism, and not just racism, but also the establishment of a large administration to further pursue the genocide of Indigenous cultures, like through the residential schools and residential hospital programs. I really hope that we stand at the precipice of a third wave in which Indigenous stewardship of the land can be strengthened through collaborative efforts to propagate and care for Indigenous plants. I really hope that we're all here today recognizing how important Indigenous cultures are and will be. And I think, you know, that these two waves of colonization didn't just hurt Indigenous people. You know, our cultures, or my culture's appalling lack of vision has really torn us all from stewarding and respectfully harvesting the earth's bounty. we've really lost touch, I think, with the sources that sustain us. And our society is now in a place where it's wreaking havoc upon the planet. So I, I really hope that we'll reflect on the work ahead and recognize that reconciling this history may take lifetimes of work. But it is my hope that every time each of us works with Indigenous plants, we come to closer relationship in repairing the land and the diverse cultures it sustains. So I'm just going to pause here um, and just check if anybody has chats um, or questions. This is my time, the end of the first section, talking about the Indigenous history on this place. Somebody has said that they can't hear me for some reason, and I'm not sure why that is. Hopefully you're the only one. Um, Great, thank you. So no questions or comments. Um, so I'm just going to go back to sharing my screen. I'm sorry. Zoom. So there is this long Indigenous history of cultivation and care for the land, and then this recent history of colonization, which has brought this radical sort of departure or disconnection between people and the land. And we're in a context today where the place where we live and want to grow Indigenous plants is heavily urbanized. And so, especially if you're in the Victoria area, you see all of this gray. And so the environment has been radically changed. We have urban heat islands where there's really intense heat, like it can be 2 or 3 degrees hotter in the city than it is in the country, just because of all the concrete that's around. There are a lot of so-called invasive plants that have arrived here and that have really made it difficult for some Indigenous plants to thrive because of the habits of some of these plants that have been introduced. A lot of the soils in our area have been so heavily altered and changed that they can be described as anthropomorphic soils. They're kind of human influenced and even human created soils. We've massively altered our waterways. I know here in Victoria, me and my sons go down to Bowker Creek sometimes and hang out underneath of the road on the creek, standing on willow roots. And it's the only place you can connect with the creek in Victoria anymore because all the rest of the creeks are underground. There's a lot of pollution and contamination in the urban environment, and these are all contexts that we have to deal with, especially if we're urban growers. Some of you may be lucky to live out in the country where you have slightly more natural conditions. But we also have, in today's context, a lot going for us to help us with growing Indigenous plants. There's abundant organic waste that we can use to turn into soil to help plants grow. We have now quite a green-minded politics in this region, and even in the last 5 years, it's become a lot easier to be growing Indigenous plants on boulevards, in your front yard. Nobody kind of turns your nose up anymore if you're going to do a bunch of rewilding in your front yard and flip your lawn over and grow a bunch of Indigenous plants. That was something that you might have had some not such great relations with your neighbors a decade ago. And so it's nice to see that we're making advances in this way. And there are a lot of community resources that exist to support Indigenous plant propagation and growth. And I'm going to speak more about some of those resources as this presentation goes on. I told most of you that all of my pictures got taken off of this. This is the one picture I couldn't find in the 10 minutes I had to put them all back in. I had an image here that was showing the difference between Victoria and Vancouver's climate, and particularly the amount of water that falls. Victoria is actually one of, if not the driest place in the summertime in all of British Columbia. It's actually drier than Kelowna in the months of July and August. We have a very, very dry Mediterranean climate here on southern Vancouver Island, and it's quite different than Vancouver. And the graph I showed how different it was. The amount of rainfall we get here in Victoria is almost half of what they receive in Vancouver. We have very ocean influenced moderate temperatures, and around, and especially with urbanization, and even without it, with all of the different geographical features, there are a lot of different microclimates that exist around southern Vancouver Island. And so lots of different places where different plants have found niches to grow. And so we have in our region a really interesting sort of tapestry of microclimates and different little niches and zones in which a diversity of plant life can grow. And I think it's interesting to recognize that that we have really dry summers, um, and that's an important thing to keep in mind as you're trying to get little delicate plants to grow through their first year, especially. Um, this is an interesting image that I found of our native soils on Vancouver Island. We tend to have quite heavy clay soils around southern Vancouver Island, silty, gravelly, sandy clay, they call it on this map. um, and most of the soil on Vancouver Island has been heavily influenced by glaciation and created in some parts by the compression of ice on rock. But a lot of that ice also scraped a lot of soil off of the rocks, and so we also have a lot of exposed bedrock. Um, but we also, like I said before, have a lot of anthropomorphic soils. So if you live in the city, it's unlikely that the soils that you have in your front or your backyard, especially your front yard, are kind of the so-called native soils that have been there forever, or at least since the land emerged out of the sea. It's likely a strange mix of fill and all kinds of other things that have been put there in your property. So these are the conditions that we have to work with as people who are interested in growing indigenous plants from seed. So I'm going to pause again and see if anybody has any questions about our local conditions or any of the considerations that are important before we dive into getting to know your site. And yeah, there's somebody that asked about earthworms and that they aren't native to our soil here, and I've heard that too. There's a lot of different, well, there's a few different worms I know that live in the soils, and I think that the big earthworms are an introduced species. Earthworms are a creature that wasn't very well studied. Not the first one that scientists were really keen to learn a lot about. And so, in the period of colonization, when there was a lot of and continues to be a lot of creatures kind of being introduced to this place, there hasn't been a lot of documentation about what was here before or after in the scientific literature. And so I think it is kind of difficult for them to know which worms in some cases were or weren't here. It's definitely not an area of expertise for me, but I've heard that they aren't native to our soil either. But I haven't heard anything about them being particularly problematic for any of the indigenous animals that live here. Relatively benign colonizer, perhaps. Yeah, so the meadows around UVic and from UVic all the way to downtown, there's little parcels left of intact Gary Oak Meadow, but they are few and far between. There's a bit of meadow left at Government House, and there's the meadow at Beacon Hill Park, a few meadows that are relatively intact. The soil is sort of a relatively clay dominant mixed clay sandy silt loam. Uh, the dryness of our region isn't exactly related to urbanization. No, it's actually the reason why it's so dry here is that we live in the shadow of the Olympic Mountains, and so the Olympic Mountains provide the rain shadow for us. A lot of the rain that comes off of the Pacific Ocean, where sort of the dominant weather kind of comes towards this part of the world. All of those rain clouds butt up against those big mountains, and as the clouds rise, they drop a lot of their moisture on the other side of the mountains, and so on this side of the mountains it's quite a bit drier. And so the southern end of Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands, the San Juan Islands as well, are in a unique climatic zone that is quite dry, a very Mediterranean climate. And so we have this unique ecosystem here, the Garry Oak kind of meadow ecosystem that is the most endangered sort of ecosystem in Canada. Because it's been so heavily urbanized, and also it's a relatively small area in Canada that's hiding behind the Olympic Mountains. Thanks for those questions. I'm going to jump back into the presentation now. We'll go back to sharing my screen, and I want to talk a little bit more about getting to know your site. So you may not be interested in growing on an urban lot. You may have a big property, or you may have some public land that you're interested in trying to grow on, or some other place. But it's always good to get to know your site. And because we live in an urban area, I think it's important to recognize that kind of trying to restore the natural landscape back to what it may have been or what it was 100 or 200 years ago, that may not be an appropriate goal anymore. I think it's important to recognize that the conditions, especially in the urban areas, have changed so much that a sort of partial renaturalization with a hybrid of indigenous plants and perhaps even non-indigenous plants may actually be the best thing for your site. And by best, I think I'm meaning that it might actually be the best for the local wildlife, that it may be also better for the soils that exist and for the climatic conditions that exist on your site. So when you're getting to know your site, there's lots of things to keep in mind and to consider. You want to pay attention, especially to sun and to how sun falls. And it's important to know that sun doesn't fall on any part of land the same way all through the year. So in the wintertime, the sun is much lower towards the southern horizon. It passes through the sky on a very low angle towards the south here in the northern hemisphere. And so in the wintertime, even in the middle of the day, if you look at where the sun is, it's leaning quite heavily towards the southern horizon, whereas in the summer, the sun is almost directly overhead, or is directly overhead at the middle of the day. And so in the wintertime, you get a lot more shade, especially on the north side of things, than you do in the summertime. And understanding how sun moves across a property all through the year can be important to thinking about which plants are going to be best suited to different parts of that property. Moisture conditions is also another thing to really keep in mind. And usually, depressions in land are places where moisture flows. Water flows to the low point. So if you have a low point in the site that you're working with, it's likely one of the wetter parts of your site. So getting to know where moisture kind of flows to and which areas are wet, it can be useful to pay attention to the site all through the year and to notice where water pools, where water sits, where water drains to and flows, getting to know which areas are wetter, which areas are drier. How does wind move around the site? In which way is the prevailing winds? Are there areas that have really big kind of wind tunnel effects? And the soil condition too is an important thing to pay attention to. Do you have some parts of your site that have deeper soils, other places that have more shallow soils? Are there some places that have more organic material in the soil? Are some soils kind of more clay dominant? You can dig a little bit down into the soil to kind of see what kinds of soil you're dealing with. A simple test of rubbing the soil, getting a little bit of moisture on your hand, even just a bit of spit, and rubbing the soil between your fingers and feeling. And if it feels really kind of slippery and smooth and kind of tacky or sticky, that's a sign that it's quite heavy clay soil. If it feels very gritty and like you can almost feel the particles of soil, it's quite sandy. if it's got a lot of organic material in it, it'll have a lot of that kind of humusy, sort of dark brown or black kind of rich humus kind of character. Uh, Another thing I find is important to really know about a site is the weed species. These are your plants that you may have to really deal with, and I find there's lots of weed species, and certainly different weeds in our region are worse even in different places. Some of the common ones that people really like to complain about are things like morning glory. Scotch broom can be an issue in certain areas. It, you know, Buttercups, like the introduced buttercups. I have a big problem with this kind of hybrid dandelion that in my yard. Um, what else do we have to deal with around here a lot? Different kinds of couch grasses and these sort of introduced grasses that grow a lot through rhizomes. So their roots go out sideways and they come up and they get underneath of all plants, and they're just very difficult to weed out. So what are the weed species that you're dealing with, and get to know your weeds. Don't just kind of appreciate them for how they grow, and get to know their life cycle and how they have success. And that will help you to defend against them, I guess. So those are some of the things to think about when you're getting to know your site. Um, and it can be really helpful to kind of create a map of your site. And this is a map. That last image was taken from this meadowscaping handbook. That's a really great meadowscaping handbook from down in the Willamette Valley. I'll share a link at the end of the presentation to that handbook. And this is another image from the Garry Oak Ecosystem Recovery Team's handbook on gardening in the Garry Oak ecosystem. And it's a nice little hand-drawn map to show you kind of an example of how to draw a map of a site, and thinking about some of those different kinds of considerations when you're looking at a site. And one thing, as you're starting to think about where you want to plant things or where you want to grow things, you might want to think about sort of what animals do you want to attract, what landscape features are going to stay the same, what things are going to change in your site. Really being clear about what your goals are. Are you interested in attracting pollinators? Are you trying to produce food for yourself? Are you interested in bringing a big diversity of Indigenous plants back? Are you wanting to start an Indigenous plant nursery or a seed saving operation where you can share Indigenous plants with all of your friends? All of these different kinds of goals might affect how you go about planning for your site. And what plants are going to grow well, obviously, is probably a really important consideration. Consider soil moisture and quality. How big will they get? What do things look like in different seasons? These are all important considerations. And then the Garry Oak Ecosystem Recovery Team's handbook, they identify these different sorts of groupings of Indigenous plants. And I thought this was somewhat helpful, especially from a beginner's perspective, to think about grouping plants in different assemblages. So you have some plants that are sort of used to growing, or that grow very well in sort of like a meadow type of assemblage, where you have lots of flowering plants in sort of an open meadow that's a mix of grasses, graminoids, and other kinds of flowering lilies and other indigenous flowers. Woodland type plants are plants, that have your bigger trees, and then other understory plants in more of a woodland setting. Rock outcrops have their own sort of unique plants. You have things like stone crop that grow really well on very shallow soils in rocky conditions. Moist soils attract certain kinds of plants that like to have a lot of moisture around. So there's plants that would do well in a moist spot that wouldn't do well in other parts of your property. Containers too can be an interesting thing, especially for an urban grower, to think about plants that will do well in containers. Pond edges and wet areas are also obviously suited to certain kinds of plants, are suited to those sorts of areas. And if you're lucky to have that kind of a site that has these features, then you'll want to plan accordingly. Hedgerows are very common in agriculture as a way of attracting pollinators, and they can also be really great. Instead of having sort of your traditional cedar hedge in your city, you could have a hedge of all kinds of really lovely indigenous shrubs. And there's lots of different ways of grouping hedgerows, and a shrub thicket is sort of like a hedgerow on steroids, just a bigger sort of grouping of shrubs. So these are different ways of thinking about design elements that you could place around your site. So as you kind of start getting into it, you can start placing things and thinking about where plants are going to go. Group plants with fellow community members and try to keep things kind of as they would like to grow together. I find, pardon me, I find that it's really good to pay attention to plants. And if you want to become a good plant grower, you have to become a good plant watcher. And so get to know the plants in your neighborhood and understand and think about who's growing happily with who nearby. And that can be a really good sign for who might grow happily together in your own property. So learn from the plants, and I always think that the best teachers are the plants themselves. As you're starting to think about what plants to put where, really try to pay attention to the plants and see what they're doing and try to learn from them. So the last thing on sort of site design that I want to share is about plant selection, and I'm actually I want to take you to the website of Saanich Native Plants, because they have these great resources on their website which describe different collections of plants and plant lists. And for beginners or even for non-beginners, I find these plant lists are just really helpful. So here we have their Saanich Native Plants resources, and they've listed all of these different plants that are good for different conditions. So if you have a space where there's partial shade, and you're looking for indigenous plants with partial shade, you can come here and see this very helpful, impressive list of different indigenous plants that like to grow in partial shade. So for us beginners to growing and saving seed from indigenous plants, these lists can be super duper useful and a good way to continue your planning. So if you're, I've just talked about all these different conditions, and you may have been wondering, well, how do I know which plants are good for these different conditions? My quick answer would be go to this website. It's really quite useful. Obviously, though, this is it's a map. It's not the whole thing, and every map is it's a representation of something real, and the real thing is always more complex. And so again, paying attention to the plants and trying to learn from them, and recognizing that there is a process of learning that's going to take you a lifetime to figure out. I certainly can't share everything in a 1.5 hour workshop with you, but this is a good resource, and I think you should I think you would find it useful. So I'm just going to stop sharing this screen. You pop back in my big face here. So that's the end of the section about sort of site considerations and thinking about your site. I'm just going to pause and see if anybody has any questions. A comment about Himalayan blackberry being rampant. Yes, Himalayan blackberry is a tricky plant. A comment that Google Earth is a great resource for learning about the topography of your area and seeing how water will naturally move in the landscape. You can add and remove filters like roads, buildings, place names, topography, etc. That's really nice. Thanks for that. And the CRD also has a natural atlas, which is a really interesting mapping tool, which is quite useful as well. So Google Earth and the CRD's natural atlas can be, to get that satellite eye view. It's amazing the technology that we have today to be able to look down on the Earth and yeah, think about it. Any other questions or comments related to site design or site considerations? Sort of the work before we get into talking about planting seeds. So there's a question about suggestions for renters who want to convert the lawn to meadow. I got a ticket from bylaw, which cost a lot. All I had was overgrown lawn. So we are going to talk a bit more about transforming a lawn and like preparing a site for planting. Uh, the issue of bylaws stuff, I think knowing the bylaws and the rules, I guess, is an important thing. This I know the city of Victoria and the municipality of Saanich are becoming much more amenable to letting people grow on boulevards and on public land that they're stewarding. And I know that as a renter, it's a difficult situation. I lived for a long time as a renter, and it's challenging. You have to deal with your landlord as well as the public land people. I'm sorry you got a ticket. But yeah, we will talk a bit more about converting a lawn to meadow, though, so I won't go into that right now. Jen has just showed a neat map showing soil types. Thanks for that, Jen. I'll try to compile all of the great resources that people are sharing um, and share them back in an email at the end of the presentation. I'm going to send that email to everybody who registered for this event. So if you didn't register or didn't provide your email address when you registered via Eventbrite, you can email me. I'll share my email at the end of the presentation. If you want to get that email from me, just let me know. Okay, I'm going to take that as no more questions about site prep, and I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, and we're going to start talking, I believe, about planting from seed. So Indigenous plants, they're not like vegetable seeds. They're used to sort of fending for themselves a lot more than vegetable seeds or cultivated flowers are. And so they're not so used to people getting in the way and trying to handle them and tell them when to grow. So when we're trying to start and plant Indigenous seeds, we need to be very mindful of the natural sort of timing of things. And a lot of Indigenous plants, pretty much all Indigenous plants, really want to be planted in the early fall, in the time when the seeds are naturally dropping off of the plants. And so um, the best time to be seeding things is usually kind of right around the end of August or the first 2 weeks of September. And I've been told to really try to plant things right before we get that first kind of real rain in September, usually. And you want the seeds to go out so that it's called imbibing. They can absorb up some of that moisture in the first real rains of the late summer is a great time, the sort of best time for planting Indigenous seeds. There are some things that will germinate in early spring if you plant them out sort of probably in late February, early mid March, maybe up until now. And I've listed those here on screen, the perennials and the annuals, but it's a relatively small list, right? There are hundreds of Indigenous plants, and almost all of them like to be seeded in the late summer or early fall. And there's essentially two methods by which the seeds kind of grow and germinate. Some Indigenous plants they don't need a cold period or a winter stratification. They will actually sprout in the fall, and they want to grow, and some of them only grow roots, and so you don't necessarily see a lot happening, but they need to sprout and grow those roots down. Sometimes they do sprout up and produce leaves as well, but it is really important for their life cycle and for them to to germinate in the fall, and they go through the winter, and then in the spring they really start to grow, or some of them will actually grow quite a bit in the fall, and you'll see green growth um, that will stand through the winter. A whole other kind of collection of seeds requires a period of cold stratification to germinate. And so that means that the seed needs to get cold. And ideally, it needs to go kind of down to frost and to freezing. So some people will uh, sort of cheat nature, and I've done this where I've taken, for instance, lupin seeds, which have a very kind of thick, hard seed coat, and they really need that cold stratification to be able to germinate. And instead of letting them go through all through the winter, I put them in ice cube trays, and I put a little bit of water with the seed and pop them in my freezer for a week or two, and then I just plant the ice cubes. And that can be a way to kind of cheat nature and get the plants to grow in the spring if you've forgotten to plant them in the fall. But really, the best thing to do is to be patient and to plant your seed in that relatively narrow window in sort of late August, early September. So one way you can plant your seed is to directly sow it into the place where you want it to grow. And this is a great way to, especially if you're interested in like a meadow, and you have especially a bigger area of land, trying to purchase plants to put into your meadow can get very expensive very quickly, because a seed is a lot cheaper than a plant that somebody has had to put the energy into growing. Um, and it can be just a kind of a quick and easy way of starting out a meadow. What's really recommended is to use a sort of a bulking agent like sand, perlite, or sawdust, so that when you're broadcasting the seed or spreading it around, you've got something else in there to help make sure that you're not getting these huge clumps of seeds in any one place. The other nice thing about a bulking agent like that is that usually they're easier to see than the seeds themselves. And so it helps you as a source of feedback to see how well you're doing with evenly distributing that seed. And it says here to use a half cup of bulking agent per 1 meter squared of seed. So every seed has a different sort of number of seeds, or sorry, every plant has a different number of seeds that would ideally be in a 1 meter square section. Saanich Native Plants makes up um, customized seeding blends and mixes, and they have recommendations on how many seeds for individual species should be in like a mix for 1 meter squared. So um, if you're purchasing seed, and I really recommend getting seed from them, um, or from a sort of another reputable indigenous plant nursery if you're not from around here, and then they will have the information about how many, or like this packet is for however many squared meters of seeding, and then you can kind of do the math on how much bulking agent to put in from there. I hope that makes sense. Um, it is really important when you're seeding things to have good contact with the soil. Often what's recommended is that you just broadcast the seed and let it lie on the surface of the soil. A little bit of roughing up and patting the soil down and just helping the seed kind of fall through the cracks can be useful. A lot of seeds are very, very small, and they'll naturally find little holes and things in the soil, and so don't need really anything beyond that. Some bigger seeds sometimes it can do better with a little bit of roughing up, but just making sure that the soil um, is in good contact with the seed is really important, and that helps the seed to imbibe or soak up moisture so that it's going to germinate. So one thing that I've found in direct sowing is that weed competition can be really difficult. If you don't do a good job of getting rid of the invasive or the difficult weeds, it can be really hard to weed around really very small, tender seedlings that have just emerged. And the reason weeds are weeds is usually because they are very fast growers, and they grow fast and big, and they crowd out everything else. And And so if you have a bunch of weeds in with more tender indigenous plants, those weeds will outcompete and can really stop your indigenous plants from growing. So it's a lot easier to try to get the weeds out before you plant the seeds than it is to try to get them after. And that's easier said than done. It's certainly you want to try to get all of those like grass roots, all the morning glory, all the buttercup, and all the other plants that are in the soil. Try to get them out if you can see them. But there's also all of the weed seeds, which are pretty much impossible to remove mechanically from the soil. But you do want to try to have, as best you can, a really nice, clean soil surface to be seeding onto. And the other thing that can be important is making sure it's nice and sort of smooth or level, or at least not like really pitted, because what happens is water will, or may at least flow, depending on your soil condition and how much water you're putting onto the soil. And if that water starts to flow, it can wash seeds with it. And so you can get sections where there's no seed and then sections where the water kind of pools where all the seed is. And so you want to try to avoid that. And you can do that by making sure that you grade the land in such a way that the water isn't going to wash seed around on the surface of the soil. So for site prep, really what's recommended is sort of one of two methods. Sheet mulching is a very popular method for gardeners. It's become super popular through the sort of permaculture work. And here is a Toby Hemingway, who's a kind of a permaculture writer, is sort of best ever sheet mulch. Essentially, what you need for a sheet mulch is a layer that is going to block all plants from growing through. So a layer of newspaper or cardboard that's essentially like a weed suppression layer. Everything below that layer is going to rot and die in the soil and add nutrients and value to the soil. It's nice if you can put underneath of that layer some soil amendments like lime, rock, dust, green sand, etc., and a thin layer of manure to sort of encourage all of the bacterial, fungal, animal life that's going to eat up all of the grass or whatever it is that you're trying to suppress, and sort of turn all of that soil underneath the layer. And then on top of that layer, you can put a bunch of different things. Here in this, they've got a thin layer of manure, some sort of hay stable bedding or other bulk organic material like leaves would be a common example, 1 to 2 inches of compost, and then some more of that bulk material on top, straw, leaves, or other seedless mulch. I've certainly done this in the past without all of this organic material, just cardboard and a little thin layer of soil on top of the cardboard, and that can work quite well. You want to have a good thick layer of cardboard or newspaper and make sure there's no cracks in that. Some things like morning glory, they just like being underneath of the cardboard and will grow roots and run all through the sheet mulch. And so certain plants don't get destroyed that effectively by sheet mulch, and certainly morning glory is the one that comes to mind for me. But this can be a really nice way to turn a lawn or another kind of weedy area into a garden with relatively little work. And everything that was growing there just breaks down and adds to the health of the soil. Another really popular method, and this is the one that I've heard for, especially for indigenous sort of seed and plant growth, solarization is really popular. And you can see it's fairly simple. You put down a sheet of plastic, clear plastic or black plastic works fine. And they recommend putting it down for at least 6 weeks. And I'd want to leave it for probably the 2 months of the summer. You put this down through the summer months, and the sun essentially bakes everything underneath, and it kills everything underneath of the plastic. And then when you pull the plastic up, you have this really nice soil that's been tilled a little bit by all of the soil life underneath of the plastic, and is now ready for seeding. Usually this solarization doesn't kill the weed seeds, and so if you do have a situation in which you're trying to grow in an area where there has been years of weeds producing seed and dropping that seed, you can run into problems with that, and that may be something to consider. A sheet mulch sometimes can be a way of building up away from those seeds, and if you build up high enough, sometimes you can leave the seeds deep in the soil, and they don't have as much of a chance of getting up. Never count weeds out, though. That's why they're weeds. So these are two popular methods of site prep. I have a third method that I like to do, which is just flipping sod, cutting the sod, flipping it over, and then I'll put a layer of like do kind of an amended sheet mulch with. And I find if I only have like cardboard and some leaves, I like to flip the sod first because it helps to kill the grass a little bit better. If I'm just putting a little thin layer of sheet mulch on top of grass directly, I find sometimes it's not enough to actually kill the grass. But I find if I cut the grass and flip it and kind of give it a good little stab with my shovel as I go, then that works better. And flipping sod can be heavy work, but if you learn how to use a spade shovel and cut lines in the sod and just cut little strips and flip it, it can actually go quite quickly if you really kind of learn how to use a shovel well. So those are my three sort of different methods for preparing a site for planting seeds directly into garden soil. Sorry, something strange is happening with my computer. I hope I haven't just... Sorry, folks. I'm just going to stop there for a sec and see if anybody has any questions about that, about direct sowing seed directly onto soil. So somebody's asking about removing dandelions on a boulevard. I think it is really good to try to get the dandelions out of there. They have really big, deep tap roots, and they'll grow back from those tap roots, even if you just like topping them. And they can be quite aggressive, and it depends how many you have. I would certainly recommend trying to remove the dandelions if you can. Good question. Yeah, flipping the grass can bring up more weed seeds. I haven't found that to be true. I guess it can depend on what was there before the grass and how much weed seed is being dropped in your grass. No till or no dig gardening is yeah. It's another question about that. It's a really nice way of making sure that you're not disturbing the all of the life in the soil, and there's a lot of good reasons for doing no till and no dig gardening. And that's one of the reasons behind, I think, solarization and sheet mulching is that you aren't digging into the soil and you're not affecting all of those fungal networks, all of the soil ecology that lives in the soil. You're just adding more food for them on top, and so that is it can be quite beneficial. Um, Tilling does introduce a lot of oxygen and it creates this big artificial bloom of life, but then it's like a boom bust cycle. There's a huge debate on this. I could go on, and I'm not going to, but it's it depends who you ask about what's better, till or no till. Usually more organic or more sort of natural folks prefer no till or no dig. But if you're trying to kill grass quickly and with few resources, I've found that flipping it works pretty well. um, Somebody's heard that dandelions aren't native, but that they're good for bees. Dandelions aren't necessarily the bad guys. I don't really like the kind of association of plants as being bad. I haven't noticed a lot of bees on dandelions. I don't know them to be really great, but they're certainly better than grass for bees. That's for sure. And the people's lawns, like just green lawn, a lawn full of dandelions is much better for wildlife than just a lawn. But dandelions are they're weedy because they produce lots of seeds, and those seeds germinate and grow lots more dandelions. And so if you don't do something to control the dandelions, you can go from one dandelion to 1,000 dandelions in a couple of years. And if you're trying to grow a lot of other plants, that can be a problem because the dandelions start to dominate the landscape, and maybe you'd rather have camas dominate the landscape. So you may have to do some work to pull the dandelions if you want camas to thrive. Um, a question about hay or straw. So straw is hay without seeds. So straw is better. Usually hay is like a bale of straw with the grass seed still on it. And so hay can be really problematic. And if you're using hay, you want to really be careful that you don't put a whole bunch of grass seed, because hay is grass, into the garden. And that's a lots of people have had that. I've done it where you think you've got this great organic material to use in a sheet mulch or whatever, or as a mulch, and you put it down and it sprouts all this grass because the seed was still in it. So straw is better. And if you're purchasing it, you can ask for straw, or just ask for hay without seed. Um, Question: do you find that some kind of soil prep is needed for these small seeds to be able to grow, or does it work okay to plant directly into unamended soil? It really depends on the soil types. So I it doesn't necessarily need to be heavily amended. A lot of the indigenous plants, especially that grow around here, are used to growing in relatively nutrient poor soils, but it does need to be a relatively good soil medium. So you want to have a nice clean soil bed to be planting your seeds into. Certainly trying to plant into something that's got a lot of other plants that it's going to have to compete with is not ideal. Planting directly into unamended soil, I think, would be very would be fine for a lot of indigenous plants. And in my experience, that's the truth, that they germinate well so long as the soil bed has been prepared and cleared of other competition. The question about covering the seeds with mulch so that the birds don't eat all the seeds. It's not recommended to put a lot of mulch on top of the seeds. This can prevent the seeds um, from growing well. And what can happen is the seeds will sprout under that mulch, but then all of the organisms that eat the mulch will eat all of the tiny little seedlings as well. And so the seeds are then getting preyed upon by all of the organisms that eat that mulch. Um, so it's not commonly recommended. If you're worried about and having issues with birds getting at and eating your seeds, what's commonly done is using some kind of a mesh over top of the seeds. Farmers use like a floating row cover or a cloche, and that can work with indigenous plants as well. Also using like a chicken wire or some kind of a wire mesh, or there's even these plastic meshes. It's strange to be recommending the use of plastics for growing indigenous seeds, and I certainly have issue with that. But I've seen it work well, and I guess if you're repurposing plastic from other projects and things, it can be, I suppose, a somewhat ecological approach. uh, Another comment: we flipped sod for a new bed, kept under plastic to kill weeds for the winter. We'll add compost and plant this spring. Also working on native plant garden site in Tofino on Public Boulevard. That sounds great. The, the wintertime isn't as good a time for plastic to killing. They always recommend doing it through the summer, but I think through the winter is better than nothing. You might find that you've still got some grass seed and stuff in, or grass roots in this, like in the sod, that you may have to deal with, but um, that may not be an issue. I'm just reading all the comments here. Thanks everybody for their comments. I recommend people read through the chat. It's quite interesting. Better to put a covering over the new seeds that allow air. Um, so I think maybe there's a confusion here about this solarization and putting plastic over to kill the plants. You solarize before you put the seeds on. So the plastic goes down, kills all the plants that are there, and then you remove the plastic and seed onto a nice um, sort of weed-free soil medium. Um, it's best not to put any big cover over top of the seeds once they're seeded. These seeds they can't grow through too much. If you're having issues with birds and things, you can put something that's going to stop the birds from getting down there, but that's not going to stop the plants from coming up. I hope that makes sense. I think that's all the questions for now, so I'm going to forge on. I'm becoming a bit conscious of time. Um, so I wanted to share the next little section here is about what's going on. Every time I click the screen now, it's coming up. Oh, it's because there's a link. Sorry, you get my internal monologue as well. um, it can be really useful sometimes to start indigenous seeds in containers and not try to just seed stuff directly in the soil. So some of the benefits of this are that some indigenous plants are very slow to grow. Like for camas, for instance, which is pictured in the top here, it in the first year, it really only grows a very small amount each year. And and it flowers after, it can take 5 to 7 years for the plant to produce its first flowers. And so it can be a long wait. And if you're trying to seed shrubs too, or big perennials, they can sometimes take quite a long time to develop. And so if you get them started in pots, you can watch them really closely in their little pots and take good care of them before they go out into the ground. And I find when I put stuff directly in the ground, it doesn't get as much loving attention as the things that are in little containers. Um, Containers and starting them in containers may not be as suitable for annual plants, which kind of grow and produce seed and die all in one year. Those are often better to direct sow into the soil, although some annual plants you may have success with putting in pots and then transplanting those pots out after a month or two in their pot. And there's essentially two methods for starting things in containers that I've found to be useful. One is to sort of broadcast a lot of seed into a relatively small container. And then once the plants are up and growing, you can then prick out those individual plants and pot them up into larger containers. And for growing camas, this is the method that I've found most useful. So I've grown camas like is pictured here and broadcast a lot of seed in a relatively small pot or container, any kind of container that's going to hold soil will do, and broadcast that seed. And then once the camas is up, you can let it grow even for a whole year really close together. And then in the next year, you can carefully prick those individual camas plants out and pot them up into their own individual pots and let them grow on for another year in a pot. And usually by the third year, the camas is big enough that it's going to be bold, kind of strong enough to really survive in the garden well. Not that it can't survive from seed directly sown in the garden, but it's got a much better chance if it's been really carefully taken care of in a pot for a while. And yeah, so that's one method, is to sort of broadcast a lot and then to prick the plants out and pot them into individual plants. And you can grow a lot of plants in this way quite quickly. You can also seed things directly into individual pots, like pictured at the bottom here is a woolly sunflower plant that's been seeded directly into a pot. This is a picture that I pirated off the internet, and they're growing in a soilless rock media, which I think is interesting. I've always grown woolly sunflower in just like a soil medium, and it's done very well. I find it's one of the easier indigenous plants to grow, the woolly sunflower. So once you've seeded your plants, it'll be important to care for them. And I think there's this what I hear often from people talking about indigenous plants is that, well, they're used to growing here, so therefore they don't require any care, and they kind of fend for themselves. And that may be the case once the plants are established, but in the first year or two, or sometimes 5, plants do need some tender loving care from us. And it's I find always good to treat your indigenous plants just as you do all the other plants in your garden, and care for them and watch them closely. And water especially can be really important for these plants. Most of them really do appreciate water, especially through the dry summer months. And the tender young plants especially, they can be killed very quickly by drought. And so making sure that you are giving plants reasonable water. And reasonable is a difficult thing for a beginner, because it does vary from plant to plant. Some plants are more drought tolerant than others, and some require less watering than others. As a general rule of thumb, I try to not let plants go more than a week without at least me visiting them and seeing if they need water. Some plants need you to come a little bit, probably more than once a week for their first year. Some plants probably can survive less than once a week. But until you're familiar with this plant and get a sense of how much water it likes, I try to get out there and give it water as much as you can. Um, Maybe not as much as you can. They don't need water 3 times a day, but they do need water. Um, and usually, when we're watering, we want to try to give water, not just a small amount of water, but try to water well and water deeply, so that water gets held deep down in the soil, so the roots are encouraged to grow down towards it. Weeding is another thing that will be really important. Making sure that these indigenous seedlings that you've planted don't have to compete with these very aggressive weeds, and trying to provide them space to be able to grow into, without having to fend off a lot of weeds. And then disturbance free is another thing I found. Sometimes indigenous plants are not as tolerant of lots of sort of disturbance and rooting around them. And so this is, it can be challenging if you've got a lot of weeds, because you've got to get into the garden and sort of disturb around them to weed them. So you want to try to let them be as much as possible, and not disturb them too much, but visit them and care for them nonetheless. Another thing about indigenous plants that I've gotten a lot of joy from, and it's not necessarily seeding so much, but um, once you've got plants happy and established in your garden, they kind of take off sometimes, and and can produce a lot more plants. And so it can be fun to watch. Like, a lot of them will drop their own seeds, and then the next year you'll get all of these new little seedlings coming up that can be dug up, potted up, and given to a neighbor or a friend, or put into another part of your garden. So self-propagating plants are definitely something to keep an eye out for once you start growing indigenous plants. You can grow plants too from cuttings. The picture at top is basil cuttings from lupin. Lupin grows really well in this way. At the bottom, there's some cuttings of currant. Some of the hardwood cuttings of like our shrubs and trees that grow around here can be grown just from a piece of them if you try to root them from a cutting. There's lots of good propagation books about how to take cuttings and divide plants. So this is another way to grow and to propagate indigenous plants. So we're getting to the last section now. I'm going to pause here again and just see if anybody has any more questions about growing indigenous plants from seed, or growing indigenous plants. Um, a great recommendation on a resource for solarizing with plastic. There's a 3-way trial, if you search that, by Charles Dowding, for a comparison of different solarizations. So if you're potting camas from seed, you need to protect it over the winter. No, camas is used to being outside all winter, so you can keep it outside all winter. It doesn't need to go in the greenhouse. I had some camas seed that I had in a greenhouse this spring, and they did get a bit of a jump in the greenhouse, and I think they're going to kind of like it, but you can just have them outside. I'm doing a bit of an experiment with some camas in the greenhouse. Usually people just keep them outside. Um, you do want to sometimes protect them if you have like pests that might get into them, but otherwise don't need to worry too much. Taking a cutting, do you put it directly in the soil generally, or do you need to put some rooting hormone on it? It does depend on the plant you're taking cuttings from. Willow is the great example of something that always roots from a cutting. It has natural rooting hormone in it. Most other things do. You have much better success if you use a rooting hormone. You can actually make a natural rooting hormone with willow, um, but you can have success, and I have had some success with rooting cuttings without rooting hormone. Sometimes bottom heat really helps with getting cuttings to root as well. What is your favorite way of watering these plants? I find deep watering difficult without using drip lines. Yeah, so once I've got established plants, I do like drip lines a lot, or even soaker hoses. Hand watering too can be very effective. Just using like a sprinkler setting on a hose nozzle, or even watering cans if you're growing things in pots. It just takes more time. Certainly, it can be a laborious process in the summertime. Watering my garden from hand in the summer takes probably 45 minutes to an hour for a fairly big garden. So it takes, yeah, it takes time. Cuttings can be direct sown into soil or put into water. I would recommend getting a book on plant propagation to learn more about cuttings. I'm not going to get too much more into it. I've got one right beside me. There's lots of good books about plant propagation. They usually have good images, on how to do it, and lots of information. So check those out. The library has some. I'm not going to get into which plants grow from cuttings. A lot of them do. Um, it's a good question, though. I've got 13 minutes. um, will chickweed take over a native species boulevard, or is it seen as a cover crop while bulbs are coming up? Um, it's a good question. It sort of, I think it kind of depends on what plants you're growing with chickweed. Some plants are more robust and able to withstand some competition than others, and it also depends on the conditions, whether it's a condition that's like chickweed favorable or the indigenous plant favorable can be an an issue. So um, uh, I can't, I don't know how to answer that other than saying it sort of depends, and I'm not totally sure. But with chickweed, it can work as a, like you say, a bit of a cover crop. But if you let it seed itself and produce lots of seeds, then it's going to become kind of more and more of an issue. And one thing with weeds, usually you can let them grow for a while until you notice they start to flower, and that's the time to get in there and try to get them out before they seed, because one weed usually turns into thousands of weeds. That's why they're weeds. Um, so I'm going to get to the last part of this presentation, which is one of kind of my favorite part, and one that I hope I can sort of inspire you guys to try out. And it's saving seed from native plants. So um, this is a workshop that's been hosted by the Greater Victoria Public Library in association with Life Cycles. I should have mentioned that off the top. Life Cycles and the library operate the Victoria Seed Library, and I was the founder of the Victoria Seed Library, and we're really interested in trying to grow our collection of Indigenous plants and to support people in growing and saving Indigenous plants from seeds. So to do that, it is really important to get to know your plant and to know it through its different phases. So here we have camas. You've got camas bulbs in the ground. Around this time of year, they start to emerge, and you see all of their beautiful green leaves. And then in a month or two, we're going to start to see all of their spectacular flowers and these beautiful purple blossoms. And then those flowers will get pollinated, and the pollination will produce seeds. And so on the right-hand side here, we have the camas seed pods. So as a seed saver, we want to try to make sure that we're saving ripe seed. And ripe seed means seed that's been able to fully mature on the plant. So for camas here, we'd want to allow the seed to fully mature and dry down on the plant. And when we harvest seed, we want it to be kind of rock hard, like really, really dry and hard. That's our main goal. And with Indigenous plants, it's challenging to save seed because these plants aren't they haven't evolved in harmony with people in the same way that vegetables have. And what I mean by that is that they haven't had people coming and saving their seeds every year. They've been fending for themselves in terms of how they disperse their seeds. And so they scatter their seeds quite a bit quicker than a lot of vegetables do. And I've found one thing that can be challenging, and it's not true for all indigenous plants, but for some, they shatter really quickly. And shattering is this sort of technical term for seeds bursting and spreading. And so they go from being not ripe to being shattered really quickly. The period in which they're ripe and you're able to go and get them from the plant can be quite short. And so if you are interested in saving seed from indigenous plants, it's important to really watch the plants and get to know them well. And you may find in the first year you don't have a lot of success because you think, oh, the seed's almost right, but I'm going to leave it another day, and then maybe you forget, and then you go out the next day and it's like all shattered. Um, and so paying attention and getting to know the plant is really important, and getting to know when it's ripe, and making sure you never want to harvest unripe seed because it's not going to be any good. It won't germinate, or if it does germinate, it may be lower vigor or lower quality. So there's a few things that I want to talk about in terms of collecting seed. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get this the bar of our pictures out of the way. When you're collecting seed, it's super important to really, I think, recognize the ethics of harvesting indigenous plants. And I don't think it's ethical to harvest from wild populations of indigenous plants unless you have explicit permission. Indigenous plants, I think, should be left to scatter their seeds, and certainly it's not something where you should never take seed from a plant where it's not in a super big and healthy, diverse, massive population. If it's a relatively sort of threatened small population, leave the seeds there. Don't take them. And it's on us to learn how to grow the plants and then save the seeds in our own sort of gardens, in our own settings, and to get the plants and grow them ourselves, get them from a nursery. The Saanich Native plants, they produce all of their own seed and they share it with the community. So I think we would do well to try to do the same. They have collected seed from so-called wild places, but they've done it in a very careful way. And I don't recommend gathering seed in the so-called wild. I mentioned shattering and the challenge of shattering. So when you're collecting seed, like I say, you want it to be nice and dry. And my favorite method is just to do it by hand and to gather the seed off of the plants. Sometimes if you have a lot of seed, like in the image on the right is a nodding onion, you can harvest the whole sort of seed head, cut it off, and then put it upside down in a paper bag and harvest a bunch in that way, and then thrash the seed around in a paper bag and stomp on it, rough it up, try to separate the seed from the chaff, and then you have seed and chaff which needs to be cleaned, which I'll show in the next slide. One thing with the shattering that can be useful is that if you can't get there to hand gather the seed, you can put down, if you see your seed is almost ripe, you can put down a paper or sheets to catch the seed so the seed doesn't fall in the soil, because once it lands on soil, it's very, very difficult to see. But if you put down a white piece of paper or a white sheet, the seed can shatter and land on that, and then you can use that to collect some of that seed. And so that can be a method for collecting shattered seeds that isn't collection by hand. And I've found that can be quite useful. Another thing that's good to know about seed saving is that when we're saving seed from an individual plant, we're not getting the representative sample of genetics from that species. Our one plant has only a few of the genes of that species. For instance, me, Matthew Kemshaw, I don't have inside of me all of the genome of the human being. I have just a little subset of those genes. And so if there was a catastrophic event where only I was allowed to reproduce into the future, generations on, we have what ends up happening is this thing called genetic bottlenecking, where we don't have all of the diversity of the genes anymore in a population. And this results in what's called inbreeding depression, which results in plants that lack vigor in subsequent generations. So it's sort of the reason why we're coached from early childhood not to marry our cousins, right? It's good not to be inbreeding too much. And if we are saving seed from a few indigenous plants, I think it's just important to recognize if we're sort of starting to cultivate these plants in a way, and the diversity of genetics is important. And this is something that Saanich Native Plants takes very seriously. And so they're evaluating their plants all the time, and they are introducing more genetics into their seed collection all of the time to make sure that their seed is robust genetically. And so if you get really into this and you're saving a lot of seed and sharing it with your friends, it's just something to think about. And I'm not exactly sure if there's more that I want to share about it, but just knowing that this is an issue, and that we definitely don't want me being the one person who's providing indigenous plants from my own little home garden where I have just a couple of plants, right, to everybody in the city, because then everybody in the city would only have the genetics that are represented in my yard, and that would be a bad thing. I think is kind of what I'm trying to say with this slide. So once you've got your seed saved, sometimes people just pick the seed out and they got clean seed right off the bat. You can save a large volume of seed, though, if you do, like I said, and cut plants and put them into paper bags. And then you've got the work of separating seed from chaff. So there's essentially 3 different ways to do that. One is just kind of the laborious separation with your hands. One is using a screen. So you can use different size screens. And this Victoria Seed Library has a couple of different screens of different sizes. So the seed will fall through, or the seed won't fall through, and everything else falls through. And you can, over time, clean your seed. And then winnowing, in the bottom right-hand corner, you use wind and just dump the seed in chaff. And the heavy seed falls through, and the wind blows away all of the chaff. And you keep dumping over and over again. And after a while, you get all nice, clean seed. The Victoria Seed Library has an interesting, relatively small collection of Indigenous plants. These are the Indigenous plants that we have in our collection. I wanted to list them here because I think it's an interesting subset. It shows you kind of like, these are actually a lot of the easier Indigenous plants to grow, and some of the more common ones. And so I thought it would be kind of fun to share this. And we are, like I said, actively interested in trying to grow our collection of Indigenous plants. But we do have a collection in the Victoria Seed Library, a seed collection. If you're interested in learning more about the Victoria Seed Library, you should join us at the next member orientation session. The member orientation sessions are a prerequisite to becoming a member of the Seed Library. Once you've attended this 1-hour seed saving workshop, you are then eligible to sign seeds out from the Victoria Seed Library collection. We have a collection of over 200 seeds, 200 varietals, many more than 200 seeds. And it's a really amazing collection of locally grown seed. It's all seed that's been grown in this area. There's some really amazing seeds in there. I think it's a very cool project. I won't say too much more about it because I'm very short on time here, just 1 minute left. So I just want to say thank you all for attending, for participating. Like I said, I will share a list of resources for further learning, and I may also share a brief little feedback form. I'd really love to get your feedback on what you thought of this workshop. I thrive on feedback, and I appreciate your feedback very much. So if you have 5 minutes or 2 minutes to fill out that little feedback form, I'll share along with all of the resources shared. Here's my email address, matthewkemshaw@gmail.com. And I also just recently created a website, mostly for the work I do in schools. I didn't mention that I'm a school garden coordinator in the Souk School District. I help some of the high schools out there with their school gardens part-time. And I also work part-time doing a few other things. But I share some of my work on my website. You may find some of that stuff interesting. So I'm going to stop and see if anybody has any questions. I want to thank the library one more time, the Greater Victoria Public Library, for making this workshop possible. Their partnership with Life Cycles to support the Victoria Seed Library has been just such a lovely and enduring partnership that I've appreciated since the day we started the Seed Library. So if you haven't checked out the library recently, you should. They're pretty great. And it's 8:30 now, so I welcome you to leave if you want to, but I'll stick around, and I see there's a few more questions here. So if you have questions, I'm happy to field them. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and hope you have an enjoyable rest of your day. Miner's lettuce is considered a native plant. There are two varieties of miner's lettuce. There's what's known as the Siberian miner's lettuce, which is a perennial. Um, and then there's the just miner's lettuce, which is an annual. So the annual miner's lettuce self-seeds every year. So it grows and dies all in one year, but it grows back from seed readily. And the Siberian miner's lettuce is a perennial, so it grows and survives for many years. They're both indigenous plants. Question: what do you recommend for places that don't have nearby native plant nurseries like you have in BC? Where should I source native seeds from? It's a difficult question. I think there's usually in a lot of places sort of native plant groups, or it might be worth trying to track down other people who are interested in this topic in your local area and finding out what they do for getting seeds. Check out your local nurseries and probably asking at a local nursery or somebody who grows plants and sells them. You know, that's, I guess, a nursery. They should know too. They would be a good source of knowledge. That's nice to see so many people appreciating this. I will try to provide propagation resources. Thank you for the reminder. I haven't thought of doing a follow-up session in the future to provide more specific information on individual native species, but it's an interesting idea. There are so many species. There is a workshop coming up that's being hosted by Kristen Miskelly from the Saanich Native Plants, and I'll share the link to that. I believe it's April 5th or April 6th. It's on meadowscaping, and so she's going to talk specifically about meadows, and I think she will talk about specific plants that are good for meadows. So if that is your interest, then I would really recommend going to that, and I will share that resource or link to that presentation, which is coming up in a week or two. I'll just scan back through the chat to see if anybody's waiting for a question. But if you have a question, if you're around still and you are looking for, I think that may be the end of our question period. Thanks everybody for coming and for your very generous and warm messages. Okay, friends, I think that brings us to the end. I'm gonna end this meeting. Have a good night.